This story is inspired by a real near-death experience. Names and events have been altered to protect privacy and enhance dramatization. If you've experienced an NDE or know someone who has, share your story in the comments. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a computer screen and a small desk lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered surface. Piles of papers and open books surrounded a man in his mid-40s. His thinning hair was combed back neatly, though it failed to hide the years of stress etched into his features. His frame was stocky, suggesting someone who had once been athletic, but had since let the years of desk work take their toll. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the monitor with a furrowed brow. On the screen was a half-written article titled, "Why Belief in an Afterlife is an Illusion." He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms and letting out a sigh. This was his latest piece, another logical takedown of spiritual ideologies. It was his passion, his purpose, or so he thought. For Mark Reynolds, life was straightforward. A man of science, logic, and cold, hard facts, he had little patience for the intangible. He prided himself on being a skeptic in a world he believed was consumed by superstition. For him, there was no mystery to life. It was a biological accident, a series of chemical reactions, and when it ended, that was it. Mark had built a career on this certainty, writing books and articles debunking what he called the myths of humanity. His audience loved him for his sharp wit and refusal to entertain nonsense. It gave him a sense of control, a foundation on which to stand in a chaotic world. But his personal life told a different story. Mark's obsession with logic had come at a cost. Friends had drifted away, tired of his dismissive attitude. His family relationships were strained. His brother, a devout believer, hadn't spoken to him in years. Even his marriage had dissolved under the weight of his unyielding worldview. Mark wasn't blind to these things, but he justified them with a simple mantra. The truth doesn't care about feelings. It was a Thursday afternoon when the call came. He was wrapping up another meeting when his phone buzzed. A text from his editor reminded him of a looming deadline, and Mark frowned as he jotted down a note. Distracted, he grabbed his coat and car keys, preparing to head home. The drive was routine, the kind of commute that became automatic after years of repetition. The city streets blurred into familiar patterns of traffic lights and billboards. Mark's mind wandered to his article, refining arguments in his head and rehearsing the sharp counterpoints he would deliver to critics. As he merged onto the highway, the sky began to darken. Clouds gathered in heavy clumps, threatening rain. Mark glanced at the clock on the dashboard and calculated how quickly he could make it home before the storm hit. He didn't notice the car speeding through the red light until it was too late. The collision was violent, a sudden eruption of sound and force. Metal twisted and groaned as his car spun out of control, the airbags deploying with a muffled explosion. Mark's body jolted violently, his head slamming against the side window. Time seemed to slow as the car flipped, glass shattering and scattering like glitter in the air. When the car came to rest, upside down in the median, silence followed. The world felt distant, muffled, as if it were underwater. Mark's vision blurred, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. Pain radiated through his body, sharp and unrelenting, but his mind clung to one thought. This can't be happening. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision, the sounds around him fading further. He could hear faint voices, shouts, and the distant wail of an approaching siren. But none of it felt real. His grip on the world was slipping. And then everything went black. The silence was the first thing Mark noticed. After the chaos and noise of the crash, the absence of sound was unsettling. He tried to focus, to piece together what had just happened, but his thoughts felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. A cold numbness crept through him, dulling the pain he had felt moments earlier. Then came the light. At first, it was faint, like a flickering bulb in a darkened room. But it grew quickly, expanding outward until it surrounded him completely. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, warm, and strangely comforting. Mark's logical mind tried to make sense of it. He must still be in the car, he reasoned. Maybe the paramedics had arrived, and he was seeing the beam of a flashlight or the glare of emergency lights. But as he opened his eyes, or what felt like opening them, he realized he was no longer in the car. The world around him was different. There was no highway, no wreckage, no sound of sirens or shouting voices. Instead, he found himself floating in a vast, empty space filled with light. There were no walls, no floor, no sky. Just an endless, glowing expanse that seemed alive, pulsing gently with energy. Mark's first reaction was confusion. What is this? He thought, his mind racing for an explanation. He looked down at himself and froze. His body was there, but not quite. It was translucent, faintly glowing, like a ghostly silhouette. He could make out the outline of his arms and legs, but they didn't feel solid. Panic flared briefly, but it was quickly replaced by a strange calmness, as if the space itself were soothing him. "This isn't real," he said aloud, or at least he thought he did. His voice didn't echo. Instead, it dissolved into the light around him, as though the space absorbed it. "I must be dreaming. This is just a hallucination. It has to be." But even as he tried to convince himself, the reality of what he was experiencing became harder to deny. The light around him wasn't just light. It was presence. He could feel it, like a quiet hum vibrating through every part of him. It wasn't oppressive or intimidating. It was welcoming, as if it were waiting for him to understand something. Mark tried to move, but there was no ground to push against, no air to propel himself forward. Yet, he was moving, being drawn, gently but irresistibly, toward a brighter point in the distance. The light grew warmer as he approached, shifting subtly in color, from gold to soft hues of pink and blue. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever known, peaceful yet profound. As he moved closer, Mark began to see shapes forming within the light. At first, they were indistinct, like figures emerging from a fog. But as they came into focus, his breath, or what passed for breath in the state, caught in his chest. They were people, or at least, they appeared to be. The figures were luminous, their forms glowing softly against the radiant backdrop. Their faces were blurred, as if viewed through frosted glass. But there was something familiar about them. One figure stepped forward, and Mark felt an almost overwhelming sense of recognition. It was his mother. She had passed away nearly 20 years ago, taken by cancer while he was in his 20s. He had grieved her loss but had long since come to terms with it, or so he thought. Seeing her now, exactly as he remembered, her warm smile, her kind eyes, unleashed a flood of emotion he hadn't realized he was holding back. "Mom," he whispered. His voice trembled, the word barely audible. She didn't speak, but her presence radiated an unmistakable message: love, comfort, and reassurance. It was as if every unspoken word, every unresolved feeling between them, was communicated in an instant. Mark wanted to run to her, to embrace her, but when he reached out, his hand passed through hers like a beam of light. Despite the lack of touch, the connection was undeniable. Before he could process what was happening, other figures began to emerge. Some he recognized immediately: his childhood best friend, his favorite college professor, a colleague who had died unexpectedly years ago. Others were less clear, their faces and forms blurred, but their presence felt familiar, as if they were connected to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Time didn't seem to exist in this place, or if it did, it flowed differently. Mark wasn't sure how long he stood among the figures, absorbing their warmth and the profound sense of connection they offered. They didn't speak in words, but their thoughts and emotions flowed into him, filling him with an understanding that was both overwhelming and deeply comforting. Then, the light shifted again. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the radiant expanse. Mark felt a pang of loss as his mother's presence slipped away, but the light around him grew brighter, drawing his attention forward. A new presence was emerging, larger and more intense than anything he had encountered so far. It wasn't a figure, but a radiant, formless energy, a glowing orb of light that pulsed with unimaginable power. Mark felt an instinctive awe, a reverence that came not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of its essence. The presence seemed to envelop him, not physically but emotionally, as if it were peering into the deepest parts of his being. And it knew him. It knew everything about him, every thought, every action, every hidden fear and unspoken hope. Mark felt exposed, vulnerable, but there was no judgment in the presence. Only understanding, only love. A single thought echoed through his mind, so clear and resonant that it felt as though the light itself were speaking. "You are not alone." The words, or the thought, reverberated within him, carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. For the first time in his life, Mark's unwavering belief in logic and reason faltered. He wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize it, but deep down he knew the truth. This was real, and it was changing him. Mark stood suspended in the radiant expanse, his translucent form bathed in the soft glow of the infinite light. The words, "You are not alone," still echoed in his mind, lingering like a melody he couldn't shake. The presence that had spoken to him, or communicated with him, in a way that transcended speech, felt overwhelming yet deeply comforting. It wasn't something he could rationalize, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to. As he floated there, the light around him began to shift. What had been a uniform, boundless radiance now seemed to take on texture and dimension. Threads of light appeared, stretching out in all directions like veins of energy. These threads pulsed gently, as though carrying currents of something alive. Mark watched entranced, as the threads began to weave together, forming patterns too intricate to comprehend. He felt drawn toward one of these threads. Without understanding how, he moved closer, as though the light itself were guiding him. The thread expanded, and within it, Mark saw something extraordinary, a scene from his own life. He was a boy again, no older than 8, sitting on the front steps of his childhood home. His knees were scraped, tears streaking his dirty face. His mother knelt beside him, her gentle hands wrapping a bandage around his leg. He remembered this moment vividly. How he had fallen off his bike while trying to impress the neighborhood kids. At the time, he had been too embarrassed to accept her comfort, brushing her away with a mumbled "I'm fine." But now, watching the scene unfold, he felt something he hadn't noticed then. Her unwavering love and quiet patience. The vision rippled and the scene shifted. He was older now, a young man in his early 20s, standing in a lecture hall during his college years. His professor, Dr. Wilkins, was returning a graded paper to him. Mark had aced the assignment, earning a rare smile of approval from the stern academic. At the time, he had taken the moment for granted, thinking only of his own achievement. But now, he saw the scene differently. He noticed the pride in Dr. Wilkins's expression, the way his eyes softened as he handed over the paper. It wasn't just a grade. It was a gesture of encouragement, a belief in Mark's potential. The thread shimmered again, and the scenes came faster now, one after another. Some were small, seemingly insignificant, holding the door open for a stranger, offering a colleague a kind word during a stressful day. Others were larger, more defining moments. The arguments with his brother over faith and science, the icy distance that had grown between them over the years. Each scene carried an emotional weight that Mark could feel deeply, as though he were reliving the moments rather than merely watching them. But the most startling revelation wasn't what he saw. It was what he felt. For the first time, he experienced these moments not just from his own perspective, but from the perspectives of others. He felt his mother's quiet pain when he had brushed her away, the warmth of Dr. Wilkins's pride, the subtle gratitude of the stranger whose day he had brightened. Even the tension and frustration of his brother during their arguments became clear to him in a way it never had before. It was as though every interaction, every choice he had ever made, was part of a vast web of connection, and his actions, no matter how small, had sent ripples through that web, touching lives in ways he had never imagined. The realization hit him with staggering clarity. Nothing was insignificant. Every moment mattered. Mark's thoughts raced. How could he have been so blind? His entire life, he had dismissed the idea of meaning beyond what could be measured or quantified. He had prided himself on his skepticism, his refusal to entertain the illusions of spirituality. And yet, here he was, confronted with an undeniable truth. Life wasn't just a series of random events. It was interconnected, woven together by threads of love, kindness, and shared experience. As the vision subsided, the threads of light around him began to pulse more brightly, their patterns shifting and expanding. The radiant presence that had enveloped him earlier seemed to grow closer, its energy intensifying. Mark felt as though it were preparing to show him something even greater. The threads wove together, forming what appeared to be a massive, glowing tree. Its trunk was wide and sturdy, branching out into infinite limbs that stretched far beyond his vision. Each branch pulsed with energy, and Mark could see the threads he had followed earlier weaving in and out of its structure. It was alive, vibrant, and impossibly ancient, exuding a wisdom and power that left him in awe. He approached the tree, drawn by an irresistible pull. As he neared it, he saw that its branches weren't just threads of light. They were connections. Each thread represented a life, a moment, a choice. They intertwined and overlapped, creating an intricate tapestry of existence. And at the center of it all was the glowing trunk, the foundation upon which everything rested. Mark reached out to touch the tree, and the moment his hand made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him. It wasn't painful. It was exhilarating, filling him with a sense of understanding that defied words. He saw the interconnectedness of all things, the way every life was linked to every other, forming a vast and beautiful whole. He understood that his own life was a part of this tapestry, not separate, as he had always believed, but integral. The presence returned, its light merging with the tree's glow. It didn't speak, but its message was clear, resonating deep within him. Your life has meaning. Your choices matter. You are not alone. Mark wanted to stay here forever, to bask in the light and wisdom of this place. But even as he thought this, he felt a subtle shift in the energy around him. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, and the threads of the tree began to dissolve into the radiant expanse. A gentle pull started to draw him away. No, he thought, panic rising in his chest. I'm not ready to leave. Not yet. But the pull was insistent, and he realized with a sinking feeling that his time here was coming to an end. The last thing he saw before the light consumed him completely was the tree, its branches glowing one final time, as if to say goodbye. Then, everything went white. Mark was engulfed by light. It was no longer the soft glow that had welcomed him, but something far more intense, like standing at the center of a star. Yet, it didn't hurt or overwhelm him. Instead, it filled him with a profound sense of clarity. He wasn't sure how, but he felt as though the light itself was alive, conscious, and deeply aware of him. The radiant presence surrounded him again, not in a physical sense, but emotionally, spiritually. It wasn't like a person. It didn't have a face, a voice, or a shape, but Mark felt it watching him, knowing him completely. It wasn't threatening or invasive. If anything, it felt deeply compassionate, as though it understood everything about him without judgment. Mark's first instinct was to resist. His logical mind still clung to the remnants of his old beliefs. This can't be real, he thought. It's just a hallucination, a trick of the dying brain. But the presence responded, not with words, but with an overwhelming wave of emotion and understanding that silenced his doubts. It wasn't arguing with him or trying to convince him. It was simply showing him the truth, and the truth was undeniable. The light around him began to shift, forming what looked like a vast, infinite web. Each strand of the web pulsed with light, radiating energy outward in all directions. Mark recognized the threads he had seen earlier, the ones connecting moments and lives. But now he saw them on an unimaginable scale. The web wasn't just his life. It was everyone's life, intertwined in ways he couldn't have fathomed. The presence guided him to focus on one part of the web. A thread pulsed brighter, and within it, Mark saw a memory. Not his own, but someone else's. It was a woman sitting on a park bench, crying softly. She was a stranger to him, yet he felt her pain as if it were his own. He watched as another thread connected to hers, showing a moment from his life. He had walked past her that day, noticing her tears but doing nothing. Mark felt a pang of guilt. He had been in a rush, telling himself her sadness wasn't his business. But now, through the web, he saw the ripple effect of that moment. Her pain had deepened, isolating her further, until she lashed out at a loved one, creating a chain of hurt that spread outward. Before he could fully process this, the web shifted again. This time, he saw a moment where he had offered a kind word to a struggling coworker. The coworker's thread glowed brightly, and Mark saw how that small gesture had given the man the confidence to pursue a project that changed his career. The ripple spread outward, touching countless others in ways Mark could never have imagined. "You're showing me this for a reason," Mark thought, directing the thought at the presence. The response wasn't verbal, but he felt its meaning clearly. Every action matters. The scenes continued, weaving together moments of kindness, neglect, love, and indifference. Mark began to see his life not as a series of isolated events, but as a tapestry, each thread connected to countless others. The understanding was both humbling and overwhelming. He had always believed his life was his own, that his choices only affected him. But here, he could see the truth. Everything was connected. "Why me?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. "Why show me this?" The presence responded with another wave of understanding. Mark felt the answer resonate within him. "Because you needed to see." The light shifted again, and Mark was drawn back to the glowing tree he had seen earlier. But this time, the tree wasn't just a structure. It was a living embodiment of the web. Its branches stretched infinitely, each thread representing a life, a choice, a connection. The presence guided him to touch the trunk, and the moment he did, an overwhelming sense of purpose filled him. He saw himself returning to the life he had known, but not as the man he had been. The presence showed him visions of what could be, moments where he chose compassion over indifference, understanding over judgment, and connection over isolation. He saw how those choices rippled outward, creating waves of change that extended far beyond him. Mark wanted to stay, to understand more, but the presence conveyed a clear message. "You are not done. Your work is not complete." The words filled him with both hope and sorrow. He didn't want to leave this place, this peace, but he knew he had to. The light began to shift again, growing brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. The last thing he saw was a radiant tree, its branches glowing with infinite potential. The light surrounding Mark grew impossibly bright, enveloping him in a warmth that transcended physical sensation. He felt weightless, as though every burden he had ever carried, his doubts, fears, and insecurities, was being lifted away. The overwhelming presence was still there, larger and more profound than anything he could comprehend. It wasn't something he could label or categorize. It was simply everything. He tried to speak, but words felt inadequate. Instead, his thoughts flowed freely, and the presence seemed to respond without hesitation. "Why me?" he asked again, not out of defiance, but genuine curiosity. "Why show me this? I've spent my whole life denying anything like this could exist." The response came not as words, but as a cascade of images, emotions, and sensations that flooded his mind. It wasn't a reprimand or a justification. It was an answer he could feel. His disbelief, his skepticism, even his outright rejection of anything beyond the material world. None of it mattered here. The presence wasn't bound by the constructs of belief or denial. It simply was. One image stood out among the flood of understanding, a single thread of light, faint and flickering. It was his. He watched as it intertwined with other threads, each connection forming a vibrant part of the larger web. Some connections were strong, glowing brightly, while others were faint, barely visible. He could feel the significance of every interaction he had ever had, every kindness, every harsh word, every moment of indifference. You have always been part of this, the presence conveyed, even when you didn't believe. Mark's mind reeled. He had spent so much of his life convinced that nothing mattered beyond what could be measured and proven. Yet here, in this place beyond comprehension, he saw the undeniable truth. Life wasn't just random. It was interconnected, every action sending ripples through the vast tapestry of existence. The presence guided him to focus on a specific thread. It pulsed softly, drawing his attention. Within it, Mark saw a memory of himself as a teenager, arguing with his younger brother. He had mocked his brother's faith, calling it childish and naive. The argument had driven a wedge between them, a divide that had only grown with time. As he watched the scene unfold, Mark felt not just his own emotions but his brother's as well. The hurt, the confusion, the sense of betrayal. It all flowed into him, raw and unfiltered. He had never understood the depth of the impact his words had made, but now it was undeniable. The thread shifted, showing another memory, this one more recent. He was at a grocery store, handing a small amount of money to an older woman who had been short at the checkout. At the time, he had thought nothing of it, brushing off her gratitude with a polite nod before moving on with his day. But now he saw how that simple act had affected her. She had been at a breaking point, overwhelmed by the struggles of her life, and his small kindness had given her a glimmer of hope. That moment had rippled outward, influencing her interactions with others and creating waves of positivity he could never have foreseen. Mark felt a profound sense of humility. Every action, no matter how insignificant it had seemed at the time, had mattered. The presence conveyed this truth to him in a way that felt absolute. Your life is not about belief. It is about connection. The threads of the web began to shift again, forming intricate patterns that glowed with an inner light. Mark felt himself being drawn toward the center, where the presence seemed to grow even stronger. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that whatever came next would change him forever. As he moved closer, the web dissolved into a single, radiant orb of light. It pulsed rhythmically, each pulse resonating within him like a heartbeat. He felt as though the light were inviting him in, offering him a glimpse of something even greater than what he had already seen. When he reached out to touch the orb, the moment of contact was overwhelming. A surge of energy coursed through him, filling every part of his being. It wasn't painful. It was pure and exhilarating, like being immersed in the essence of life itself. In that instant, he understood. The orb didn't just represent the interconnectedness of life. It was life. It was every moment, every choice, every connection, all woven together into a single, unified whole. It wasn't bound by time or space. It simply existed, eternal and infinite. The presence conveyed one final message, its meaning reverberating through him like a symphony. You are not done. You must return. Mark's heart, or what felt like his heart, ached at the thought. He didn't want to leave. Here, in this place of light and understanding, he felt whole in a way he never had before. But the presence was insistent. It wasn't a command or a demand. It was a truth he couldn't deny. You have more to do, the presence said, not in words, but in a way that was undeniably clear. Your life has meaning. Your choices matter. Return and live with purpose. The light around him began to shift, growing brighter and more intense. Mark felt the pull of gravity, the weight of his physical body calling him back. Panic flared briefly. He wasn't ready to leave, but the presence reassured him with one last wave of warmth and understanding. As the light faded, Mark felt the threads of the web unravel. the radiant orb dissolving into a soft glow. The world around him darkened, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, with a sudden jolt, he was back. Mark's first sensation was the crushing weight of his body. His chest heaved painfully as his lungs struggled to pull in air, each breath feeling like fire. The warmth and peace of the light were gone, replaced by cold, harsh reality. The world around him came into focus in fragments. The flashing red and blue of emergency lights, the sharp smell of gasoline and smoke, and the muffled shouts of paramedics. "He's back," someone exclaimed, their voice trembling with relief. Mark felt a pair of hands pressing against his chest, and then another wave of pain as his ribs protested the movement. Every nerve in his body screamed with discomfort, but he was alive. His eyes fluttered open, and he was met with the blurred outline of a paramedic leaning over him. The man's face was tense but hopeful. "Stay with us," he said firmly. Mark tried to respond, but his voice wouldn't come. Instead, he gave a faint nod, the effort draining what little strength he had. The next few hours were a haze. Mark vaguely remembered being loaded onto a stretcher, the cold metal of the ambulance floor against his back, and the rhythmic thud of the siren as it sped toward the hospital. The pain in his body was relentless, but his mind was elsewhere, still lingering in the light, in the presence that had changed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Waking up in the hospital, when Mark awoke again, the world felt quieter. The steady beep of a heart monitor was the first thing he noticed, followed by the sterile scent of disinfectant and the faint hum of machinery. He was in a hospital bed, a 4-line running into his arm, and his body felt like it had been through a war. A nurse entered, her movements brisk but gentle. "Good to see you awake," she said with a warm smile. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Mark tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his voice came out as a rasp. She handed him a cup of water, and he sipped it gratefully before managing to croak out, "What happened?" "You were in a car accident," she explained. "Cardiac arrest on the scene. You were technically dead for a few minutes, but the paramedics managed to revive you. It's a miracle you're here." A miracle. The word hung in the air, carrying a weight it never had before. Mark had always scoffed at the idea of miracles, dismissing them as coincidences or wishful thinking. But now, the word felt different. It felt real. Processing the experience. Left alone in his hospital room, Mark's thoughts raced. The memory of the light, the presence, and the web of connections was vivid, etched into his mind like a brand. He closed his eyes, trying to summon it again, but it was distant now, like a dream slipping away upon waking. What had it been? A hallucination? A trick of a dying brain, as he might have argued before? But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It wasn't something he could explain, not with logic or science. It was something he had felt, something he had understood in a way that transcended words. Mark thought about the message the presence had conveyed. You are not done. He had been given a second chance, but why? What was he supposed to do with it? He had spent his life dismissing the idea that anything mattered beyond the here and now. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything mattered. Reconnecting with life. The days that followed were slow and painful. Physical recovery was hard enough. Broken ribs, bruises, and a concussion. But the emotional toll was even heavier. Mark found himself questioning everything. His beliefs, his choices, his purpose. His first step toward healing was reaching out to his brother. It had been years since they'd spoken. The gap between them widened by years of arguments and hurtful words. Mark stared at his phone for what felt like hours before finally dialing the number. When his brother answered, the voice on the other end was cautious. "Mark, it's me," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, his brother sighed. "I've missed you, Mark." That conversation was the first of many steps,